Hello everyone, I'm Taaka Awori, founder and CEO of Busara Africa, a Pan-African leadership development firm. Welcome to the Leadership in Africa Redefined podcast. This podcast seeks to do two things. One, change the narrative of leadership in Africa, and two, provide concrete strategies and tips for leading in an African context. We do this by interviewing amazing African leaders so that the narrative of leadership in Africa is defined by the best of us, not the worst of us. We share their stories and provide practical suggestions for dealing with the challenges of leading on this continent. We discuss, interrogate, and examine concrete leadership practices that work. We also look at failures that these leaders faced and how they navigated their ways back on track. It's an exciting and empowering space for leaders to thrive and engage. Subscribe to the show to become the leader you have always wanted to be. And if you like the show, be sure you rate it and review it. It helps others to find it. Thanks so much. Okay, so hello, and welcome to another episode of Leadership in Africa Redefined, the podcast. My guest today is Deprose Muchena, who is the Senior Director for Regional Operations, Human Rights Impact at Amnesty International, where he oversees Amnesty regional offices across the globe. So today we're having, it's one of those conversations I've been looking forward to for a long time. But it's also one of those conversations that when people talk about leadership, this is immediately where they veer to. They think politics and they think about political leadership. And the topic for today is, I am not going to be talking about all the negatives because I think all of us, too many of us spend our times talking about what's going wrong with political leadership in Africa today. So I have a fantastic guest who is the right person to have a conversation with me on what we've entitled this episode as is Positive Political Shifts, Lessons and Insights from New Leadership. And the reason we're having this conversation is 2024 is a busy time in terms of politics on this continent. And my guest will confirm with me later if I have it right. But I think we have almost 19 elections that were happening, around 19, over the course of 2024. So lots of movement in terms of new leaders coming in, old ones not going away and just being there forever. But we're not here to talk about those negative examples. So who do I have with me today to have this really interesting conversation? I have none other than Deprose Muchena, a man who I tell you I've been hounding for a long time because he's a very special man. But at least the key thing is I think he's the right person to talk about what's happening in terms of political leadership on this continent. But not just his knowledge. When I was writing the book, Leadership in Africa Redefined, and I was asking people, who are these leaders that you would really say exemplify the type of leadership we need on this continent? Deprose's name kept coming up. So we thank him too for exemplifying the leadership Africa needs and deserves on this continent. So Deprose, you're welcome. How are you?
I'm first of all very humbled to be here, and but very, very excited to be here, Taaka. You know, I follow the podcast. I have read the book. I have put the book up on my weekly Leadership Book of the Week series on X or Twitter, as I still call it. And I'm just delighted to be having this moment to talk with you and talk with the audience about things that matter for us, normally things that everybody is searching for, which is leadership in many of our parts of our lives, in the world, in church, in football teams, and so on. So yeah, I hope we can pack a few ideas in the conversation.
Thank you so much, Deprose. And you've thank you first also for being such a wonderful promoter of the book. Much, much appreciated. And you will see from the podcast, we've talked about leadership in other spaces, but I really want to zone in as a human rights advocate and the work you've been doing as Amnesty. I want to hone in on political leadership. And particularly, I want to hone in on the positive examples you're seeing. So maybe my first question for you, Deprose, is can you provide examples of positive shifts in political leadership that have caught your attention over the last 2, 3, 5 years on the continent?
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Taaka. First of all, I think it's important to situate leadership in general, positive political or positive social and political leadership in particular in a context. We are in a world right now in 2024 that is experiencing tectonic shifts, whether it's in the economy, with rising inequality, the emergence of a super rich class that is mopping up every available resource, a CEO class of billionaires of the 10 top richest corporations, 7 of them are led by billionaires as their CEOs. You have wars in almost every continent. Here in Africa, Sudan, experiencing a gruesome war that now is characterized as the largest internal displacement crisis in the world. People who ran to Sudan as refugees from other countries are going back to Sudan, to countries where they came from, which are still afflicted by problems. You have got low intensity war conflict in DRC, 100 armed groups operating just in the eastern part of DRC. And then you have countries in perennial crisis. They are not going anywhere. They are now on standstill. From Cape to Cairo, you've got a number of candidate countries like that. So the continent is part of a globe that is experiencing seismic problems that are not going away. Around the world, we're also seeing this emergence or resurgence of authoritarian politics or authoritarian political culture, with authoritarian legalism, the use, the abuse, the non-use of the law for primitive political gain by a superclass of people who hold corrosive power. We're seeing trade wars, rivalries between superpowers and the hegemons of each region, whether it's in Asia, in Europe, and so on. And a climate in crisis. The countries that caused the crisis are not the ones most suffering from it. The ones that are suffering from it are the ones that did not cause it, presenting once again a disproportionate impact of global events. And then finally, you have a social crisis, the triple burden of unemployment, poverty, and inequality. So to try and locate the emergence of positive leadership in a world that is almost in flux is an exercise we must do because we are driven by the audacity of hope, to quote Barack Obama at some point. If we don't do that, then like the rest of the world, we go down with it. One thing that's outstanding in this crisis of a globe that I have presented is the super failure and colossal collapse of leadership. COVID-19 revealed to us the crisis the world was facing, one of leadership. People without imagination to unleash the creative potential of their populations to solve problems. Leadership started to emerge from smaller countries, Costa Rica, on the issue of the use of technology to lower the cost of vaccination. We started to see emergence of leadership coming from Botswana, coming from Madagascar, experimenting with traditional medicine. And the super countries were failing to provide global leadership. So I think as leaders, we must constantly search for the pathways that lead us towards positive leadership. So your question is an outstanding one, but it's a chapter in its own right in the book of leadership. Positive leadership is the ability to be hopeful in the context of chaos, the ability to see sunlight at the end of a dark wall, the ability to contextualize and know that it is darkest before it is dawn. and that as sure as the sun will rise from the east and fall on the west, change does come. And therefore, we are seeing this change come out in the world. It's coming out in our own subcontinent. It's coming out through the veneer of elections, social processes, but also people power. You know, I spent time speaking on this subject last week, and I can share some of the reasons, some of the lessons today. But this is me. I see hope, and I'm seeing more leadership that are trying to experiment with your theme of positive political leadership in many parts of the world, not just in Africa.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad how you have ended, because when you first started Deprose, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm now even becoming more depressed, because I think you almost so eloquently described the types of crises we have been facing, not just in the continent, but globally. Yeah? But I loved the way you put it, the importance of the audacity of hope. Because when you said it's almost an exercise, I thought you were going to say exercise in futility. But then I heard you say the audacity of hope. And I like where this conversation is going, because what I'm hearing from you is an affirmation of the importance of indeed looking for where is that light, where is that thread we can pull, that enables us to know, yes, something is emerging from the ashes. So I would love, I'm so glad you have been recently in conversations around this. I would love to hear a lot more about some of those concrete examples, particularly this thing around people power, and what people power can teach us about the type of leadership we need a lot more of in terms of politically on this continent.
You know, one of the things that we should always know is nobody is a leader. You know, we don't know when a child pops out of a mother's body that this child is going to be a leader. We can say we saw it when she was born. We saw it when he was born, that, you know, the way he cried or the way she cried, or he opened their palms. You know, we can do historical revisionism to justify what we have in the moment. But people are not born leaders. People become leaders. People emerge to become leaders. And we have seen that more often than not in Africa, crisis moments often generate leadership. Leaders emerge out of problems that require solutions, and people surface to this position of responsibility. You know, I am in conversation with a young man from Zimbabwe, Dzikama Ebere, you know, who is one of the most inspiring young leaders to emerge in our subcontinent. And the work he did with his colleagues during COVID-19, instead of wallowing in the pain of COVID and the hopelessness of leaders in responding to the crisis, him and his colleagues emerged and started to coordinate efforts, some working to provide support to prisoners, others working with journalists, others supporting social causes, to produce a leadership in moments of crisis. And they actually put up a book together, which looked at the contribution young people make during times of crisis. And if you go to country by country in the continent, in Kenya, in Ghana, in Uganda, in Sierra Leone, there are so many stories of leaders who emerged in moments of crisis to deliver hope, to deliver substantive contribution to unleashing the imagination of others in their community to start confronting the problems of the day. So I am fascinated by this idea of looking at leaders as people who were not born with authority and title, but people who emerged and shaped by conditions of the day to harness their calling, whether it's in church, in a social club, in a company, in an organization, or in a country, to deliver hope for Africa, to deliver social change. And we see that from the political class. We see this from the social class. We see this in academic institutions. The people who said we can deliver lectures online and not stop the education of an African child. The judges in Kenya in South Africa who said we shall deliver justice online as we use technology to continue to provide justice for people, and not use the moment of crisis to consolidate authoritarianism, as we saw from other countries who had targets that they had and used a crisis to come up with draconian legislation to go after political opponents. Leadership is not the use of power. Leadership is the deployment of influence for positive change. Leadership is the art of ensuring that all our people in a team are unable to get the results, not through my title, but through their own bonding with the assignment we have, because everyone, as we say in football, is playing for the jersey using the badge in front of the jersey, not the number at the back. You are playing for the team. So I think on the continent, we are seeing this. New startup companies, new technology that are emerging about how to use transport re-engineering to get people to move in ways that were not imagined. So I want to keep on the theme of a hopeful talk about leadership, and not the authoritarians that have to be used as examples of buffoons from the continent. And I think we've got examples, including from your book as well.
Yes, yes. And it's so interesting in many respects, Deprose. You could see there were so many amazing sound bites just in what you've said. But I think what you so clearly did was redefine the type of leadership that this continent needs right now. But what I'm taking away from what you're saying, and I always have to pause sometimes to reflect on and rehear what to feedback what I'm hearing is many of us are looking at the crises that this continent is, the polycrises, in fact, that the continent is experiencing as almost like a woe betide us. But I think what you're reminding us of is that actually it's in these crises that the leaders are emerging. And that we're seeing leadership. In fact, it's even not just leaders as people, it's taking the act of leadership. Where people don't necessarily have titles, where they don't have formal authority, but it's people stepping up. To say something needs to be done, and I'm stepping up with all the innovation, the ideas to influence others to have this thing done. And I think that's so, I'm so re-inspired by remembering, and the concrete examples that you've given us, again, inspire me further.
Absolutely.
The question that comes to mind is, and I keep bringing it to the political sphere because I want the hope that you describe to light this sphere where we have least hope. I often, in conversations around leadership, I often see people being inspired by what they might be seeing in the women's movement, in the private sector, within communities. But this one in politics is where they need most hope. So it would be lovely for you to either share some examples or hear your thinking around how this type of leadership that has emerged more organically from crisis can, or maybe is already, if there are examples of that, starting to shift the political terrain, particularly how we as Africans think of this social contract between those who we elect as leaders and that relationship we have between them. So any thoughts on that?
When I look across the continent, or even across the world, I see those who are helping us unpack the traditional notion of a leader as a person sitting atop in the 8th floor, feared with regalia, and is in the Douglas MacGregor term, is on the theory X of leadership, which is very authoritarian, power-driven, and so forth. So the dismantling of that type of leader that we are seeing with, for example, the collective identity of leaders, the collectivization of leaders as a group. We see this emerge out of Kenya with Generation Z. seeing it from outside, a group of people redefining a social contract, challenging the entire edifice of the country, inviting elders and others to have a national conversation about the use of power, about how to govern, about how to propose a national program of action with people in mind, reminding us of what it means to be people-centered. We saw that. And that was not only Kenya. At the same time that we're having this experience in Kenya, we were having an experience of the similar exercise in South Asia, in Bangladesh.
Yes.
Where young people in Bangladesh were redrawing the social contract. And we did not imagine that Sheikh Hasina, with the power she had as a member of the ruling party in Bangladesh, would run to India at the speed of an unidentified flying object, fearing young people who were using people power to reclaim citizenship, to reclaim the definition of what Bangladesh means. It's a young country born in 1971, but also reimagine its future. Nothing for us without us.
Hi, folks. Hope you're enjoying the show. So have you heard about the African Leaders Circle? Our impactful e-learning platform that enables you to grow into the leader you would want to follow? Here is a message to tell you what you need to know.
Are you a CEO, executive director, or HR manager that is looking to build a pipeline of leaders that are ready to step up into management roles? Are you looking for a self-paced learning platform that provides your leaders with quality content and does not take them away from their work for too long? Are you looking for a program that enables your managers to move from knowledge acquisition to demonstrable improved practice? Then look no further. Sign them up for the African Leaders Circle today. The African Leaders Circle is an e-learning platform that gives your managers access to an exclusive community of leaders across the continent and a wide range of strategies and tools to stand out. We do this through online courses, discussion forums, a library of resources, and a personal learning advisor to support each of your managers to maximize their learning on the platform. To learn more, visit our website www.busara-africa.com.
Don't forget to visit our website busara-africa.com to learn more. And now back to the show.
In the South Asia subcontinent, just remaining there for a while, I was there in September, October. I was also there in March to launch our global human rights report for South Asia. And I met the president there who had normalized continuity of leadership after the Sri Lanka demonstrations. He was not a new outsider. He was just part of the old guard, but was able to renew himself. He is now out of power. And I also met an opposition leader during my visit who was a complete outsider. I spoke with him and he spoke through a translator because he was speaking local language. He was branded leftist and an outsider. For the first time in Sri Lanka, we are having a president who is not part of the dynasty, who is emerging from elsewhere. And I think there are many parts of Africa that is yearning for that reality of beginning to produce leaders who are not part of the dominant ruling party, the dominant ruling party that says we died for this country, even if they are alive, the dominant ruling party that believes that its own fate is tied to the fate of the country. We are seeing a rejection of that type of leader and a reimagining of this continent anew. Now, we might not yet be there, but this is really the end game for bureaucratic, authoritarian, nationalist political organizations that believe that because they fought in the war, which, by the way, was fought by peasants, the working class, and young people of the time, because we fought, we determine who eats and when they eat. That politics is being challenged through people power. In Namibia, where we are having elections soon, SWAPO, the ruling party, is under siege from young people openly challenging the political class. There's a clip that went viral last week of a young person who damaged a Mercedes-Benz belonging to one of the political leaders in Namibia, the son of the former president, Sam Nujoma. Sam Nujoma affectionately refers to this leader as my bundle of joy. This is the young Nujoma. His car was tampered with by a young person who was completely using the language, I'm sure, of the political class, uncouth. But he said, you are lying to us. You can go anywhere and report me, but I'm damaging this car because this car belongs to us. There was another incident of a young unemployed SWAPO member who slapped a political leader who was speaking at a rally in an audience. He was part of the audience, stood up and said, you are lying for too much, and went to attack the person. I'm not celebrating violence at all. I'm non-violent in my outlook and in my exercise of activism. I'm raising these issues that there is now a limit of the production and reproduction of a leadership style that is driven by parasitic political enterprise, where we distort history and deploy history as a narrative to capture the past in order to justify the present. Have you seen in our countries where countries have leaders who speak about the past and deploy themselves at convenient times of that past in order to justify the present day society and location, either as recipients of gains that they have not worked for, or as outright extractivists who are taking away from the people? So people power is not just an African experiment. We are seeing that in Asia. We are seeing that in Europe with young people, and in the US, who are taking a stand on Israel-Palestine, the war in Gaza, and taking that and asking their political leaders, what are you doing for them? Because if you do not have the integrity to stand for those who are suffering, you certainly don't have the integrity to stand for me when I'm suffering. Because as you say again in your book, citing Chinua Achebe, integrity, one of the hallmarks and the truest standards of integrity is its relentless refusal to compromise. Leaders who are compromising because they want to gain something are a danger to us in Africa. And leaders who are surrounding themselves with military establishments to justify their presence on the chair are a danger to us. They fulfill what I call insecure leaders.
Yes.
And insecure leaders, we also find them in private sector. We also find them in the non-profit sector. We find them everywhere. Insecure leaders have kind of three major characteristics, and we see it play out. One is often when they are leading, they amplify their personal flaws. Because they are insecure, that insecurity transforms into an amplification of personal flaws in their moment of leadership. So you try to rise up and say something, all we see are your flaws, your lack of integrity, lack of passion, and so on. Insecure leaders are a danger to their countries and to themselves, because more often than not, they do not encourage anyone to rise above their level of mediocrity. So everyone then has to be standardized to behave in a particular way. If a colonial package of governance worked, retain it until now. So we limit the growth of people on our teams to our level of imagination, or as I say, to our level of mediocrity. Insecure leaders are in constant search of validation. Have you seen how every political leader in our countries want to be a supreme leader? They have got titles. They are going after honorary degrees. They are going after all kinds of titles, including from a village, to add to how they should be pronounced. It takes time to introduce your leader because they have got 4 titles before their name. So insecure leaders are in constant search of validation. They want to be loved. Insecure leaders have more to take than they have to give. So more often than not, they are bankrupting their countries because they facilitate illicit outflows of money. They facilitate transfer pricing, underpricing of exports and overpricing of imports, so that these companies look like they've got a balance sheet that is tilting in the side of spending for development for the country. So we should reject these kinds of leaders and look for these leaders who are coming from people power, who are coming from crisis in order to respond to problems in their countries. We must look beyond the normative definition of a political party to look for a leader. We must stop being obsessed by thinking a political leader is the president. The president could be the nominal leader of the country, but the amount of leadership we are seeing in our churches, in our social clubs, in our schools, the headmasters that are thinking about working with minimum resources to get the best out of their kids so that they go to university. The universities that are producing graduates who are fit for purpose, not just oversupplying people we don't need in industry and creating an industrial army of the unemployed, but universities that are partnering with others around the world to create the best of what they can for their people. This is where we should be identifying leadership to talk about and privilege those voices in a podcast that is growing in audience like this, but also in the growing continental discourse about leadership. I am passionate about joining force with you and others to start finding people-powered leaders, leaders who are made by events rather than so-called born as leaders, leaders who are a product of crisis, a product of poverty, a product of impoverished context. I mean, you and I probably experienced this where we went to school barefooted. We never thought we would be having this conversation. But for education, we're having this conversation because education is an equalizer. It equalizes people on extreme ends of the spectrum to have national conversation about belonging in a country.
Wow. Ooh. So many threads to pull, Deprose, so many threads to pull. And maybe I'm going to start from the end because there's so much you've said that has so deeply, deeply resonated. Let me start from the end in terms of what really resonated is the celebration of leadership in so many different spaces in which we're operating. Leadership that, as you say, is sometimes emerging from crisis. Sometimes it's not even a crisis. It's just people stepping up in the realities that they exist. And how can we continue to lift that up, learn from that leadership? And I hope this podcast can continue to do that. But let that be definitely a key part of our narrative of leadership on this continent. So that we're not just so obsessed with those who have titles. So that's one I want to +1 and underscore for sure. Huh? The second is I really appreciated your highlighting the issue of insecurity of leaders and the impact of that insecurity and how it shows up. Huh? And what I appreciate about it is, one of my key approaches to leadership development is I'm like, leadership happens, the best leadership is from the inside out. And that it's when you do the inner work, you are best able to manage the power, the privilege that comes to you from the positions of leadership that one is given. But if you don't do the inner work, it's almost what they say about money and power. They will really show you who you are. Yeah. And so then I guess my question about that is, and it's going to be tied to the first point you raised around, and thank you so much for those concrete examples you have given us of people power, particularly young people's power, questioning, rethinking, and really holding to account how our political leaders are using the power we have bestowed on them through our elections. And so you gave us Kenya, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and more recently Namibia. And those concrete examples are good. They remind us, they're like, actually, it's true. Yes, it's... My question along that is a couple of things. One, and I'm sure people listening will be like, but what? But. So let's respond to their buts. How do we ensure that these powerful moments of questioning and holding to account our political elites are not just moments, that they become institutionalized and part and parcel of governance? Because too many of us have memories of Arab Spring where we were so excited. We're like, yes, things are changing in Tunisia and Egypt, and when we look back, we're like, ish, what happened to that moment? So how do we institutionalize that, one? But two, Deprose, now back to your insecurity thing and the inner work. How do we ensure that this next generation of leaders who are saying, you guys need to do things differently, don't fall into the same pit as their elders did? Because there's something about the political sphere that the rules of the game, sometimes it seems only the strongest, most grounded people with integrity don't change. There seems to be something about that space that makes people it brings out the worst in people. So how do we ensure that they too don't become those very insecure leaders that they're holding to account?
That's a fantastic set of questions. And just on your last point, have you seen in our countries that were a product of colonial domination, how the colonial state came and dehumanized Africans, how the colonial state came and created what Richard Gray calls the two nations, a nation here for the colonial settlers, in particular for countries that went through settler colonialism, Kenya, Algeria, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Namibia. They really created two nations, a country for settlers and a country for natives. And the domination of land and acquisition and of land was the first structure to displace natives from economic independence, so that they start to sell their labor in industry. And once you start sell your labor, we give you a starvation wage, so you are perennially locked onto the plantation, in the mining compound or in industry. And we start regulating who comes into town, who lives in which suburb. So most of these settler societies have southern suburbs where Black people live. They are normally on the western side of the city, so that when you are going home, you face the sun and burn from it. And when you are going to work in the morning, you face the sun and burn from it. The colonial morphology of the African city mirrors a colonial design. If you go to West Africa, you see all these major roads, they lead to the port. The roads were not constructed in a manner that would create the Awori villagers and the Muchena villagers to visit each other. The roads were constructed to go to the port because it was an extractive economic model that was designed to ensure that Africa remains a periphery of the center, the metropole, the center periphery thesis of development and underdevelopment. So the colonial package was that, depriving people of their rights, of their humanity, removing labor bargaining power. In South Africa, they had what they call the Industrial Conciliation Act, which was also the same law in Southern Rhodesia, which took away bargaining power from Black labor and gave it to white folks and ensured that starvation wage were encountered. Then they created the so-called law and order maintenance legislation. Across our continent, we have this law. When the nationalist leaders emerged out of the struggle, fighting this model I'm describing, post-independent state become an instrument of reproducing the same things that our leaders, when they were fighting for independence, when they were freedom fighters, were experiencing. So our leaders transitioned from being fighters for freedom and become really freedom fighters. They fight against freedom after independence. So what we then see is African leaders and even Asian leaders emerge, and instead of democratizing the post-colonial state they expand its functional scope. And gradually, in some of our more unfortunate parts of the continent, a mafia state emerges, kind of run by a phalanx, to use George Ayiti's description, of degreed bandits, as he called them. You know, sporting Ray-Ban sunglasses and bazookas, unafraid to leash or unleash the bullet on a population that yesterday was cooking a meal for us to fight the freedom struggle. So this contradiction, that when you go through an abusive political system, you learn more of the excesses of abuse, that
Yes.
you are likely to see that as refuge when your own power is challenged. So we have a responsibility as the new leaders to break this cycle of political abuse that is constantly being produced and reproduced because we are using the same template of political governance and the same template of political leadership. So we must break with the past and turn to the new. And I think there are many young people who are providing us examples in our countries of how to do that. So that's the first thing, just on what should we do. Leadership is a construction site of renewal. Every day you wake up and you renew yourself. You read books to renew yourself. You fellowship with other leaders to learn from them so that you become a better leader. You subordinate yourself to the team so that the team is able to have what Amy Edmondson calls the fearless organization, a psychologically safe space where you are leading to unleash feedback from those you lead so that they can feel free to feed back to you without fearing for their future. The construction site that I'm talking about, where leaders are born, is only exemplified if you as the leader are facilitating this growth. And back to your question about working on yourself inside out, you have to constantly be working with what I call an emotional intelligence framework, which is the framework I speak about when I talk to young leaders, that you see, it's two parts when you are developing yourself as a leader. Within yourself, you are self-managing, which means you manage your own internal emotions and your own internal emotional state. We call that self-awareness, which is knowing your internal emotional state. That knowledge of yourself means that you don't have an exaggerated sense of yourself. It means that you are most likely to delegate as a leader. It means that you are most likely to sell when the people you lead are unwilling but able. So you sell so that they become able and willing. You know, you delegate to people who are willing and able. You don't spend your time on team members who are clearly able and willing, and you start directing them. You direct people who are unwilling and unable, you know, and then there are a quadrant of people that in your organization who ability, reasonable willingness. You co-lead with them so that you teach them values. You teach them how to do the work, not just what to do, you know. So this work that you do within yourself to manage yourself, to become socially self-aware, produces the second side of this emotional intelligence framework, which is with others. How do you lead with others? And there you need your social skills, which is appropriately managing your own interaction with other people on your team, in your group, in your country, in your village, in your province. And it produces what I call social awareness, which is awareness of others' emotional state. So leaders that are normally empathetic in the workplace are people with social awareness, not just self-awareness. They are able to feel the footsteps walked by another person on their team. And that's when after a meeting you say, Taaka, can you remain behind? I note that you spoke 3 times. You normally speak 7 times. Taaka will say, so boss, you actually see how much time I speak. That's when I'm quiet. Yes, we feel deprived when you are not contributing, because the organization, Jim Collins talk about good to great, as the level 5 leader, as the contributing manager, as the contributing team member, and as a person who is volunteering for any role that is needed. If you bring these roles together, you have a high performance team. So your idea of work inside out and work inside yourself, I completely agree with it, because when you do that, then you address the last point you were talking about, which is how do you break the cycle of reproducing terrible leaders when we know how terrible looks like. We only do that when we actually advance in the learning about leadership, because leadership learning is a journey. You don't arrive. You keep learning, you produce, you reproduce, you recondition, and you transform. We want leaders now who are not authority figures, but who are hosts, leaders as hosts. A leader who is a host of values, who is a host of norms, who is a host of positive energy that creates other hosts of positive energy. So the organization becomes more flat, it becomes more feminist in outlook in terms of sharing power. It becomes much more caring and empathetic. That doesn't make leaders soft. It makes them effective. That's effective leadership. That is leadership that can transform. That's leadership that is confident. That's leadership that amplifies confidence rather than the insecure leaders we talked about in the last question. So that's, for me, is what I see in addressing your very difficult questions that you have laid here. Work on yourself, work on others, cut the cycle of traditional leadership, understand the history of your country in order to understand its future.
Oh, amazing. And I think you've summarized it so well. And you know what I really appreciate about you, Deprose, as well, is you will always start with the context. And I really appreciate it. Just again, the reconnecting to the colonial reality. And I like the way you put it. I think one of the things I'm taking away is that for things to change, we need to break this template of political governance that we inherited as part of our colonial legacy. At that level, I think that's quite clear. So all these moments, if we want to institutionalize these moments of holding folks to account, we need to keep in mind that we're changing the rules of the game in terms of governance. But then I loved where you brought it back to self. Both the two levels of emotional intelligence, the self-awareness, but also the social awareness and the ability to leverage different leadership styles depending on the type of people. I will have to listen to this about 3 times to really sit with some of the key things you've said. I mean, leadership is a site of leadership is a construction site of renewal. And that one I need to sit with for a while and process, because it deeply resonates. And then finally, your statement, which I think we'll end this podcast with: leadership as hosts. Leadership as hosts. Deprose, you've been absolutely amazing. Now I know why I'm so glad I chased you, because truly, truly, I could talk to you forever. But your insights, your wisdom, the experience you bring to this conversation have been so deeply appreciated, not just by me, but I'm sure our viewers and listeners will also appreciate it as well. Thank you so much, my brother. Folks, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Let us know, give us a review, write a comment so we know how much you're enjoying this and what you're getting out of this. And see you next time for the next episode. Ciao.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Deprose.
Hello, wonderful leader. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the podcast. I learned a lot, and I hope you did too. If you want more of the lessons, experiences, and nuggets for effective leadership, join our amazing platform for leaders, the African Leaders Circle. Learn more at www.busara-africa.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe and share with other amazing leaders. See you soon. Ciao.